Okay. Okay, I'll come back in 10 minutes or so. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we're all, everyone's got three brains working, and
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I know. I just wanted to check I could get the PowerPoint up. That was all.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, come back in a few, and we'll be starting off, and then we'll be so much more organised.
One hopes.
All right. Thanks a lot, Peter. See you in a sec.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Cheers.
Bye.
All right. Yes. No, we've 2 minutes, and we'll start the countdown video.
Yeah, James, you saw my slides here. On
Yes. Yes. Yours came up. We'll start webinar now.
Are you wanting a slide to change this time? What? You want James?
Sorry, what?
I'm fine.
You're good.
I just want to say that it's 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye. Yeah, yeah. Was that a coffee came in?
Yeah, your coffee's there, I think, because I said don't. I thought she was going to knock the camera.
And then knock coffee over the computer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then like,
Then we'll just have a.
Did you want to drink? Okay.
You just keep drinking coffee all the time and get them lost.
Right, we are. I guess we're live. I'll mute everything.
Okay, I need to this double digital live is no good. This double, that in the digital era you can have like 3 meetings at one time. It's like not healthy, no?
Oh yeah, what time's your other meeting?
No, I just have to do a 1 minute.
This is, so you can use this mic.
Oh, mic. Yeah, we can use the same one. Okay.
Yeah. So that otherwise it'll go back and forth, like, echo will happen.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, let me find my meeting.
So does the TV have the camera?
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, then how can I read the script?
You
Oh, when you turn off the
you can put the camera like so that you can see your face, but your computer is in front of you.
okay.
Right.
This
And now
one?
you move your computer like this. Yes.
Oh,
Are you in the meeting?
yeah,
Has it started?
but I can't hear anything.
Okay. Hello. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. It'd be good to know that before. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Right, sorry. We've been offline apparently. So I don't know if I'll run through all that again, but I just want to say that our main thrust here, rethinking vehicles first, is to look at Hong Kong's de facto vehicle first policy, which is something that's just arisen. It doesn't seem to have any brain behind it. So we are looking at that from two angles. We're looking at things like parking and enforcement, which is a way that we can control the number of cars. And we're also looking at public space, which is very important. And we've got some excellent speakers lined up for that.
Yeah.
I'm James, I'm the editor of Transit Jam. I'm with Waltraud Ritter, who's our program content director. And we are in the Borough Happold offices in Wan Chai. So thanks to Borough Happold for hosting us here. Just want to say that we invited Peter Dampier of Borough Happold to speak as our keynote speaker before they offered us the office. We cannot be bought here at Transit Jam. Many have tried. So everyone's here on merit, and Peter is kicking us off with really a fantastic idea and a vision really for how public space could be used in Hong Kong. So with that, I think I will pass over to the first session, and that is to Peter. Take it away, Peter.
Okay, thank you, James. Full screen. Right. Okay, well, Hong Kong has arguably got one of the best public transport systems in the world, integrated with MTR buses, the trams, the ferries. Yet walking in Hong Kong isn't as easy as it could be. Priority is given to the 10% of the population who own vehicles. Means at-grade walking is with density and pedestrian barriers, illegal parking, deliveries, small pavement sizes, obstructions, etc., and excessive urban traffic speed, lack of strategic car demand management policies, all add to an urban heat canyon effect, air quality, making it challenging, uncomfortable, and at times unpleasant, to say the least. If you add to that the lack of quality urban public space to sit, relax, read and enjoy, makes Hong Kong quite a hostile pedestrian environment. So we actually came up with an idea, and it was the frustration of those aspects that drove me to this idea, which originally came from my own sort of journey, walking from Wan Chai to the Central Ferry Piers. And after discussion with various people, we formed a team, the Wan Chai Connect Design Group, listed there. I won't read the slide to you, and formulated an idea which was born predominantly around connectivity at the time, but also then morphed into the ability to actually create public space by holistic thinking. So I'm just going to briefly run through, obviously I've done this presentation a number of times. We presented to Wan Chai District Council, to the Hong Kong Trade Development Council, and to the Harbourfront Commission informally, waiting for a formal audience, who've all been very positive about the ideas that we've come up with. So why? So if we look at the reclamation in Wan Chai, the old coastline, the sort of urban grain in 1904 was around pedestrian and around sort of horse and cart in effect, but as the reclamation continued, you know, and the birth of the vehicle moved forward, we ended up with sort of greater and greater chasms, till we ended up with, in essence, a scar that cuts the throat of two distinct parts of Wan Chai. You can't get across that, you can only go over it. That is going to be, I suppose, infused further with the opening of the exhibition station, which is in effect the wrong side of Wan Chai, creating more. Can you start your video? Do you want me to start it? Okay. Sorry, creating more pedestrian traffic going the other way, and the only viable route at the moment is the famous O'Brien Walkway. So you've got a broken, fragmented approach there. There's only one route from Wan Chai across to the harbour. No, you don't want that. That's the sort of approach at the moment. You've got sort of, you know, if you're trying to get from Wan Chai Ferry to Pacific Place, it's a bit of a nightmare. So the opportunity, that was the idea by looking along Gloucester Road about putting a platform across the top and linking them up. But the real catalyst for this was then the announcement from the government that they were going to sell the Immigration Tower, Wan Chai Tower and the Revenue Tower site. That's front and centre to the problem of Wan Chai, and therefore we wanted to get in front of this development and spark some debate and give people something to think about, not unlike a similar thing we did with Site 3 with Benoy, which is the government has taken on board, and that's going to be a design and price sale. So moving on, the government have basically intimated there'll be a new extension to the conference centre, a hotel, improved connectivity, but they haven't said what. But they have actually mentioned recently about linking a bridge to the harbour, which is piecemeal because it only links the Hyatt Garden to the waterfront. It doesn't deal with the major problem, which is Gloucester Road. Government policy is about livability, people-centric, better public spaces, walkability. So we felt we were on the right track. So the real opportunity is the future of Wan Chai. You know, it's very well known, Jan Geller's statement about first life, then spaces, etc. Getting that right is in principle why we've started this long before. So the solution. The High Line is something that I know James noted in an interview he did with ourselves on this, and it isn't easily replicated, but we feel, it says at the bottom there, it's build a cool part and connect it to a framework. We feel that the framework is very much this. So actually it's looking at desire lines. It's an elevated approach that deals with the problem that, let's face it, they're not going to take the barriers down. You're not going to have pedestrianisation. They've been trying in DeVoe Road for 17 years. So the only way to deal with this is to actually take it at face value and create something unique that floats above and provides that connectivity, linking the MTR stations, the new MTR stations and the desire lines to the harbour. So in essence, you've got 4 spikes coming back into Wan Chai to sort of Johnson Road. You've got a linear park floating above Gloucester Road, which isn't a thick concrete structure across the entire Gloucester Road with a dark, dingy thing underneath. It's been looked at in that approach to actually have probably only 60% of it covered, and then out to the harbour. But also, as part of that, a new tower and landmark in Wan Chai to actually triangulate it with IFC and ICC. So in effect, rejuvenating the area. So there's an aerial view of it, a garden gateway, the 2 links going out, a brand new entrance to the exhibition centre, which you go under, an amphitheatre on the top, so you've got a place that you can actually congregate and enjoy across there. And again, the legs going out through the Hyatt Garden. A view which I know I've put this out on social media, so I'm sure many people have seen this, but creating something out of nothing, a linear park for citizens and tourists to enjoy alike. Vitality, cafe culture, landscaped bridges rather than the O'Brien. Let's face it, it's a monstrosity in effect. And then a link there. There's a potentially putting some F&B on the harbour. There's the bridge going back into the Wan Chai redevelopment, and then the brand new entrance with the amphitheatre. Benefits, obviously, go through all of those, but we're looking at cultural, tourism, livability, health and well-being, social, environmental, society connection, environmentally friendly, health and well-being, the cost of value, the value of the site development, and we feel this is an opportunity for the government rather than private developers to actually do this at the outset, make the site more attractive, and they would recoup the cost of this through the increased premium on the sale of the site. There you go. Sorry, I even ran over. I'm the first speaker, not a good mark.
Okay, no,
James.
only a second. It's great. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, we're using Slido, or you can use the Q&A in Zoom. If you want to use Slido, just go to slido.com, enter 852-888, and then you can ask us questions. So thank you very much for that, Peter. And now we have Oren Thatcher, who's the principal at OTC Planning and Design. And I'm just going to unmute Moran, and there he goes. Hello. Oren, can you hear us? Okay, let's see if we can find Oren. He's unmute.
Can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Is my screen shared?
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'll try to stick to my time frame. I don't know, I'm hearing this echo. I hope everybody else can hear me fine. So I want to talk briefly about the topic is improving MTR isochrones. And I think I need to start by explaining to those who don't know maybe what isochrones are. So very simplistic, this is from an online app that looks at it in the context of public transport in different cities. This is an example from Berlin. This is basically a map that shows, given a particular starting point, how far can you get in Berlin within 10 minutes, assuming a combination of mostly public transport, but also a bit of walking. And as you can see in this case, when you start from a very well-connected node, which in this case is the Hauptbahnhof in Berlin, you can get to many places within 10 minutes. You're a bit, it's a bit less so if you're somewhere in the middle of a Tiergarten when you're away from any nearby transit stop. And so really the destinations you can get to are just around those station areas. We looked kind of related to it. We looked some time back at how does Hong Kong compare to other cities in terms of in an overall journey that people take on public transport. How much of it is walking relative to riding, let's say the train, the MTR in the case of Hong Kong, or the bus? And we found that not a very scientific. We compared it to New York and Paris and other places, Mexico City. And we found that in Hong Kong, the equation between walk, wait, transit, and walk is by a significant margin. In Hong Kong, the walking part is the shortest compared to the total commute time. And the reason is that in Hong Kong, partly because our pedestrian environment is so poor, we're never actually very far from public transportation. But in the case of Hong Kong, much of that is picked up by buses and minibuses. If we did the same exercise just on MTR, the result would be much poorer, with a lot more walking and quite uncomfortable walking. So with that, we tried to do a little hypothetical study of how can you improve or shorten or improve the experience of walking to the nearest MTR stop, and through that reducing or I would say increasing the isochrones of the MTR network, in the sense that you could reach farther by just taking the MTR, because the walking from the MTR station would improve. The premise of this, I won't get into details, is the question of what is a walking experience and how does the level of service of walking as related to space, to slopes, to weather conditions, reduces or increases the walking speed and therefore shrinks the isochrones. Again, I'm sorry if I'm going fast on this, but hopefully some people are keeping up with me. We have our own metrics for level of service to do with weather protection, cross flows, amount of space available, obviously. I won't get into that in great detail, but what we did is I'm just going to skip to the findings. So we took a hypothetical case of Sai Ying Pun Station, and this is a bit of a post-rationalization to what obviously exists there, which is, as you will see, kind of more or less related to the escalator link along Center Street. But as a hypothetical exercise, if you look at Sai Ying Pun Station, which is here in the middle, and then you look at the MTR entrances to Sai Ying Pun Station, if you look, and then you pick just one entrance, which is the one on 2nd Street, or maybe it's 1st Street. I think it's 1st Street. The theory of access to public transport or to MTR stations or to metro stations is there is kind of a 6-minute walk catchment area. There are different variations to that. Some, obviously some places use 300 meters and so on, but if you just take a radius of the hypothetical walking distance or 6-minute catchment in this particular case, you will get a perfect radius, which of course is not the case. So when you account for block structure, you get something that's obviously much reduced because it's about the actual time it takes to reach the actual distance you can reach within 6 minutes, given the block structure. Again, in this case, assuming that the streets are all equally accessible and you just walk at your regular speed, and this is how far you can reach. Things shrink further when you start accounting for slopes. In the case of Hong Kong, of course, it's very important. So suddenly that isochron, the 6-minute isochron, shrinks further. And then if you look at street crossings, very important, because in Hong Kong, sometimes you have to cross very wide streets, not just in Hong Kong, with wait times for traffic lights to change and so on, the isochron shrinks even further. Then you look at level of service on the street. In this case, kind of strictly speaking, the amount of space available on the street. And again, if you consider that that means that it slows you down, you know, that your walking speed is reduced, the isochron shrinks even further. So where we end up, if you can see the dotted line, is where we started, or well, we started with the radius, and then increasingly our isochron, our 6-minute isochron of walking from the station has shrunk. Then you look at where you're trying to get to. And this is again an illustration of density. And the question is, okay, we want to increase the catchment area by extending the isochron, the 6-minute isochron, but where is my money best spent? And in this case, you can see that the highest density of destinations, origin destination, is uphill. And so that kind of suggests to you where is best to spend your money in order to improve the access to the station and therefore extend the isochron. You can look at different ways of doing it. And again, we know what ended up happening with this particular MTR station, which is a bit of a mix of tunnels to reach uphill and an escalator link. And what you see is by building this escalator link, at least in theory, you added this little piece to the isochron. So again, this is a bit of a kind of a study that's post-rationalization, but it goes to show how you can begin to prioritize investment in improvement in pedestrian infrastructure through improving the quality of the pedestrian experience in a way that increases the catchment of an MTR station in this particular case. Thank you. I hope I didn't really overextend or go beyond my time too much.
Thank you, Oren. That's perfect timing. And I live Sai Ying Pun, right in the middle of that isochrome so you were just showing.
The extension or the base?
Bonham Road. So just by so I was in it. I was in the circle and then not in the extended.
Okay.
But it's interesting. We use that MTR station actually as a shortcut down to Sun Yat-sen Park because you can go then in the lifts and through the air conditioning and come out almost by the coast. So, do you add the MTR station itself and those long tunnels into your calculations?
That's right. But by the way, it's quite interesting because that MTR station, as well as the one Hong Kong U, changed this whole approach of isochrones and in general improving pedestrian improvement is of course unrelated to the MTR. But it's interesting how the introduction of those two MTR stations changed the overall mapping of pedestrian connectivity in the area because a lot of people do what you do, which is use them as shortcuts.
Okay. So how hang on a sec, sorry, we're not visible. How visible, how manual is this process of doing the isochrones there? Are you using sort of GIS or something like that, or do you have to go out on the street and walk up these slopes yourselves?
In this case, it was manual, so it was done as an illustration. We have some parts of our level of service assessment. We do have actually software that does it. But in this particular case, getting the data into the software and then calculating the isochrones would be more time consuming than actually doing it manually through, basic.
Right. Okay. And Peter, do you have any comments on this? Is this something we could apply to the Wan Chai Connect?
Well, I mean, we've done a lot of work that I wasn't able to show, and actually we looked at the catchment area. We've done the sort of a 400-meter grid around it, etc. Looked at the sphere of influence in terms of we know the MTR requirements in terms of sort of a new station, etc. But it was more about the business, the impact. That at the moment you would just jump in a taxi to go somewhere, whereas actually if you were just out of this, you would just literally get on the Wan Chai, connect and walk through.
Yeah.
So it's very related to that, but we looked at it from a social, economic impact, influence, but rather than sort of population. And obviously we looked at the population of Wan Chai as well, but it was really about, it was interesting actually, Oren, in your presentation talking about sort of the travel times, because I became the fool that did it and tried to walk from Pacific Place, and then through our people we looked at average walking rates if there was nothing in the way, and we looked at a 30% improvement in a time to walk from Pacific Place to the Wan Chai ferry, if the Wan Chai connect was in place.
Peter, I have to say that I have as you were making your presentation, I almost laughed because a few years ago I made a presentation was exactly about this route that you just described. The presentation I gave was in the convention center, and I said, how would I get from here to Pacific Place? And I plotted the possible routes, and there weren't that many. It was about, in that particular case, it was an issue about the limited choices, but also just how tortured it was. I said, in most cities, this would be a no-brainer. If this is something you do, you walk. And in the case of Wan Chai North to Pacific Place, you just hop in a taxi or cross Master Road and get on the 104 bus or something. But it's the pedestrian option is it was exactly.
It's similar to the Hong Kong Arts Centre. If you go on their website, it says, go to Wan Chai Station. But you come out of Wan Chai, unless you know where you're going, you haven't got a clue how to find the Arts Centre on the other side of Gloucester Road.
Yeah. We're running a bit short on time, but perhaps 30 seconds from each of you on this idea of the two-envelope bidding scheme, which the government's going to propose for the new site down by the harbour. Is the two-envelope system something that we could get these isochrones or these sort of new ideas into?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we were very much part of Site 3, and again started a debate with Benoit to try and sort of move that forward and look at it from a perspective of creating value for the societal value, rather than it just being seen as a trophy site that was bought. It should be like Circular Quay. In Sydney, it should be vibrant, and you go down Hong Kong Harbour and it's very underutilised in terms of enjoyment.
Okay, actually, I'll ask you.
For me, the main issue with Site 3 is, or the main question is, how is the brief going to be written? 2 envelopes is good, but it's all about how is the first envelope going to be evaluated, according to which criteria, and who's going to do the evaluation. And that, I have to say, I'm a bit disheartened to learn that going to be judged by government, only at least the last I heard. I would have hoped that the international experts and more kind of transparent set of criteria to ensure that that envelope rules and results, hopefully. But maybe it will.
Okay, we actually really short on time. We've got some good questions coming though. Perhaps we'll ask those towards the break. See how we're doing for time. But we had some good questions coming from the audience, so we'll ask those perhaps on chat later and put those up. So now, thank you, Oren, and thank you, Peter. We have to move on to the next session. Our time is very tight, I'm afraid. Thanks very much for your interesting chat. So we're now shifting the conversation to parking, and we're going to talk to Professor Donald Shoup, who is Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning at UCLA and has written a book, The High Cost of Free Parking, and really is the parking guru. So we're going to see, he's in Los Angeles, so we did the recording ahead of time, so please. Good afternoon, Professor Shoup, and thank you for joining us in Hong Kong. I hope you're well.
Well, thank you for inviting me to Hong Kong. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm glad that I don't have to spend 12 hours in an airplane to get there.
Yes, nobody wants to sit on a plane right now. So anyway, we're very happy to talk to you online. So let's talk parking. Now, Hong Kong can't be the only city in the world with a parking problem.
Around the world, parking policies are often considered unsuccessful because they are unsuccessful. You know, the basic goal of a parking policy is to prevent chaos, and able to do even this basic function is to prevent chaos. Often in many Asian cities, you see pictures of cars parked on the sidewalks and obstructing pedestrians, and it's just a mess because the parking is free and almost uncontrolled.
In your book, The High Cost of Free Parking, it's something of a Bible in parking circles. You outline 3 main policies that cities could take to address their parking problems. Perhaps you could just outline those for us.
To summarize an 800-page book in 3 bullet points, there are 3 policies I recommend. The first is to charge the right price for curb parking. And by right price, I mean the lowest price the city can charge and still have 1 or 2 open spaces available on the block. The second policy is to make the first policy popular, and that is to spend the meter revenue for added public services on the metered streets, such as to clean the sidewalks and repair the sidewalks and remove graffiti, so that the meter money doesn't disappear into the general fund. It comes right back to help the neighborhood. And then the third policy I recommend is to remove off-street parking requirements. And of course, removing off-street parking requirements doesn't mean removing off-street parking. It just says that the parking will be a choice and not a mandate from the government.
Yes. How does a city begin to implement these policies?
To do that, the city has to be able to measure the occupancy rate of of each block all day long, and the technology is already here and it's readily available. If no spaces are open, if all the spaces are full, the price is too low. If half the spaces are open, the price is too high. So cities can adjust prices to leave 1 or 2 open spaces on every block all the time. And then I think the key thing in getting the price right is another technology issue, is having meters that can charge different prices at different times of day, and the price can be changed remotely. In San Francisco, for example, there are special events, like athletic events or concerts or parades. And in those areas, the price could go up to $18 an hour because that's what the private operators charge. And if the meters don't charge $18 an hour, there will be people driving around and around and around hunting for an open space. So I think if you get the technology right with the measuring occupancy and adjusting prices, the price of parking will settle down to the area where you have 1 or 2 open spaces. And sometimes there'll be no open spaces on a block, but if you could park in the next block, that's a good substitute.
Is this something that's applicable in Hong Kong or even China? I mean, our economic models are so different to what you have in the USA. Is this something we should even be looking at?
I haven't been to Hong Kong, but I have been to China, and I'm an honorary professor at the Beijing Transportation Research Institute. So I know a little bit about parking in China. And my 2 books on parking have been translated into Chinese, and they're going to be published later this year. So I think that once these ideas are available in Chinese, that I hope that many cities will understand that in a very dense area, it makes a lot of sense to charge fair market prices for on-street parking and spend the revenue on added public services on the metered streets. And in a dense area like Hong Kong, the percentage of the residents who can park on the street is a very small percentage of the total residents. Say in Manhattan, which would be our only real equivalent, the neighborhood I measured had enough curb parking spaces for only 5% of the residents. So it would be these 5% who own cars and who don't park off street who would be paying for all of the revenue, and 100% of the residents would get the benefit of all the public services.
One big problem we have in Hong Kong is that parking is not supposed to be free, but there's just rampant illegal parking, very rarely enforced. And so parking is not just free, but it's very plentiful because people park wherever they want to. How could we begin to solve that?
Now, to make this work well, you have to enforce the parking laws. You have to enforce that people pay for parking. And in some cities, there's very lax enforcement. And people don't expect to get tickets. And if they do get a ticket, they say, why me? It seems so unfair that if a lot of other people haven't been getting tickets, why should I get one? Well, I think that once the city gets the meter revenue, the residents of the stakeholders understand that if somebody parks without paying, they're stealing money from the neighborhood. If this money pays for added public services that the neighborhood wants, I can't predict what a neighborhood in Hong Kong would want, but I think if you ask the residents, what is their highest priority? And you spend the money on that priority, then parking without paying will not be a victimless crime.
And do you have any examples of where sort of they've had an enforcement problem and then that's been solved?
What happened in London once, the 1950s, they had meters, but there was a widespread violation. There was so much violation that there weren't enough staff to hand out tickets, and it was uncommon to get a ticket. So then they started using the Denver boot, which is this, you probably have them, but they immobilized one of the tires with a big yellow lock on it. And the purpose is not just to punish the person who wasn't paying, but it's also to show people that could happen to you if you don't pay. So quickly, London switched from very low compliance to very high compliance at the parking meters.
We've got some government people in the audience here, and perhaps they think, parking is a very humble or minor problem. What are some of the consequences of not getting this right?
Well, if cities don't charge the right price for parking, if they leave it free or underpriced, the problem that results is cruising for parking. People have to drive around hunting for a parking space, hoping to see a car leaving or hoping to find a space that is vacant. And this adds a lot to the traffic congestion and air pollution. And of course, now we have to worry about global warming. So I think one of the biggest benefits of charging the right price for curb parking is to eliminate this driving around hunting for a parking space. If you see one or two open spaces on every block, there's no point in driving around hunting for a parking space. There's one right on the block where you want to go.
And just one last question we have time for on parking minimums, which is something, of course, you suggest abolishing. We're going backwards in Hong Kong. We have a new mandate from the government to actually increase parking minimums in new buildings. So, I mean, what would you say to our government about that?
The more general complaint that I made about planning is that we don't get parking wrong, we get everything else wrong. I've never heard anybody able to explain how they set the parking requirements in their city. It's something that is done by planners because they have to when they're ordered to by the politicians. But the planners are just winging it. They do not know how many parking spaces a barber shop should have, or a nail salon, or a swimming pool, or a badminton court. But cities have parking requirements for all these uses.
Okay, Professor Shoup, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we can catch up with you again soon. Thank you very much. Okay, so fascinating. Great to talk to. We've got a question in from Anthony Lau. How much income does Hong Kong government receive annually from parking fines? Now, we have a sort of answer to that from the Transport Department, because I've been chasing them on a story about the parking in Cameron Lane. So let me just see if I can find that. Hang on, sorry. Okay, and I asked them how much revenue is lost by these triad gangs doing the car jockeys and stealing the government revenue. And they said, well, the maximum fee for use of metered parking spaces is currently $2 per 15 minutes. Since the existing parking meter system is unable to detect whether individual on-street parking spaces are occupied, it is difficult for TD to assess the impact of unlawful occupation on government revenue. So they don't know is the answer, Anthony, I'm afraid. So. Right, we are, unless there's any more questions coming in for that section, I think we'll try and get ahead a minute for the next section, which is on space and data. Now we have some really great stuff here from TRP. We have Marina Huyn, who is going to, she's a Director of Infrastructure Advisory for EY, and she is going to moderate this session. So I'm going to put her on, and welcome, Marina.
Great, thank you. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the third session today on space and mode, where we'll be exploring new ideas and concepts to break away from the ineffective silos that we often see when it comes to planning and delivering services across transport and public spaces. So our session today will showcase how better use of data and innovative thinking can drive more holistic and integrated policy and planning, and ultimately deliver better user experience and outcomes for our users, both across these space areas separately and also where they intersect. As introduced, my name is Marina Huyn. I'm a director from Infrastructure Advisory Practice from EY. Core to what I do is to support government in developing and implementing key strategies and policies around public infrastructure and services. I'm very pleased to have recently joined the Intermodal Transport Data Sharing Program, and will shortly hand over to my colleagues, Andrew Pickford and Terry Graham, who will kick off today's session on a brief presentation on this live project. Following that will be two other great presentations we have in this session. One will be on multimodal approaches to bus transport. That will be by Zhu Zizhen and Sharat Chopra. And our final presentation will be on fresh looks at active spaces and supporting healthy aging by Dr. Sun Yi. So hopefully we'll have some time at the end for an interactive Q&A session. Please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box throughout the presentations, and then we can take them in turn at the end, or also feel free to voice your questions at the end of the presentation. So let's kick off the session. I'll hand over to Andrew and Terry, thanks.
Thanks, Marina. We have 7 minutes to cover a rather large subject. So Terry, do you have the presentation?
Yes, I do. I'm going to start.
Yes. Anyway, so the subject, as Mia introduced, is around space and data. Our focus is, I guess, prioritising this would be more about data than space, but there is actually an inextricable link between them. Certainly when it comes to providing mobility in what we all observe to be actually a 3-dimensional city, not a 2-dimensional city. We have great separation, we have multiple modes, we have 90% public transport market share. For all intents and purposes, it looks pretty good. It's only when you get down into detail of operations and you start to consult with the enormous transport ecosystem in Hong Kong, then you realise that actually things could be improved. So let's take a look at what we found as part of this ITF funded project. We're about halfway through. And so Terry, next slide, please. So this is a team, including Marina, our host of this session, myself, Andrew Pickford, and Terence Graham, the co-presenter in this case, led by John Ewer, top left, and with the support around sustainability issues with Walkraut and the great support of Jenny, plus a team of research assistants led by Dr. Zhao at Hong Kong U, effectively the lead on this project. Next slide, please, Terry. So what's important? Well, surveys say many things. So this is one survey. It tends to reflect hopefully a common view, that is congestion is an issue. Transit policy and how that relates to improvement in mobility is an issue. Of course, this doesn't aggregate it down to the level of detail that you need to understand the key issues, but it's quite clear at this high level. It is congestion. It's about transport policy. It sounds like it needs more work. It needs to evolve. The government's desire to improve transport and mobility, and issues around predictability and speed. I guess predictability is probably more important since that actually reduces wastage. And again, the government's awareness of the need to implement change. This is the view of KPMG in one of their surveys. Next slide, please. So basically what needs to change in this case? We all have our own views on this, but our list is around policies, around traffic congestion mitigation, public transport and its operations, and basically willingness of all parties to adopt more of a user-centric view than a siloed view that we have currently. Innovation tends to be internal rather than external, and in general, there's little activities between modes when it comes to policy development and in terms of operational alignment between those modes. Next slide, please, Terry. The program aims of the ITF funding project is to advocate to discover more practical means of delivering a sustainable transport solution. It's about improving movement of people, improving operation efficiency, and its provision of services in general. It has to work for everybody. I improve performance, reduce costs, reallocate benefits more fairly maybe, and the use of data that in our case can actually underpin potentially transport policy evolution. But as we know, data can also be used for improving operations. That's not within our scope, but we do touch upon that in this project nevertheless. And the net result is improving transport productivity, making better use of the existing network infrastructure. And to do that, typically we need to improve the availability of the road network and thereby mitigate traffic congestion. And last but not least, of course, really improving the quality of the air for the benefit of the environment and health. Next slide, please. So brief run through this, excuse the pace. It is a rather short project, so this compressed presentation shows the breadth, including our conducting global research on best practice around collaborative models within the transport hierarchy. And that includes data as one of those binding agents alongside the contractual relationships between those parties. The whole thing, of course, is wrapped up in policy and regulation. And that at the same time has to encourage innovation, it has to direct innovation, and it has to protect the consumer interests at the same time, plus other members of the ecosystem, including the transport operators that tend to require predictability in their business, of course. So it's a difficult balancing act. The balancing point will change, of course. In order to make things more pragmatic and focused, as part of the project, we've actually identified some use cases, or rather challenge statements, in order to boil down this very abstract concepts we face in front of us into things that matter to people, such as taking an MTR and then requiring a taxi. How do you make that journey? They're very simple statements which work much more efficiently. So those simple questions have really helped prime our conversations within the team. And of course, we couldn't live without the views of other stakeholders actually propping up this program. Next slide, please, Terry. It is a multi-stakeholder project, and we consulted over what appears to be an 18-month preparatory period around 80 stakeholders in all of those sectors. So we think we've covered every stakeholder involved in Hong Kong's transport environment. Next slide, please. The engagement, of course, in short, the focus is on facilitating pilot projects. So whether we'll get time to deliver a whole portfolio of projects within the 7 months we have is rather doubtful. So what we're doing is actually prioritizing those. And the focus has actually been on Exchange Square and the stakeholders around that. Exchange Square seems to embody many of the use cases we've identified in terms of safety, accessibility, intermodal transfer, in many cases, lack of data and lack of awareness on really where to wait for your bus. It can be as simple as that in that case. And what we do see is lack of collaboration, which reflects the need to encourage that, at least between the transport operators and governments. And also the public to actually raise their knowledge of just what's available out there. And the aim is to not just develop transport, but actually mobility as a whole. Next slide, please, Terry. So data sharing is one of those binding, enabling forces alongside regulation and user awareness and understanding and willingness. So data is one of those key enablers, and it supports both urban planning, it supports road safety. In our case, we're looking to develop new insights from existing data by pooling data that exists generally in the public domain, such as static and dynamic data around transport and the movements of people. So by being able to analyze that, we can actually focus on the potential to reduce costs, improve performance, and actually reuse data for purposes where it's never been used before. So the crux of the project is about combining data from multiple sources. And we certainly need to respect the value of that data. Next slide, please, Terry. So the basic findings are there is a data ownership imbalance in Hong Kong. We see lack of alignment on the sharing of the benefits, costs, and risks between the parties, generally governments, the transport providers, and users. We don't believe there's a common view of the value of data. Of course, in many cases, it has commercial value. And again, we need to respect that. There's also no common approach to technology adoption. There are some very well-funded players, and there's some less well-funded players. And government has committed to invest currently in green minibuses to, again, bring them up to speed, excuse the pun, in actually properly connecting with the with other parts of the transporting environment and being able to connect better with the users. And we also believe that technical capacity varies also between those operators. And there's certainly not a common understanding of really how those benefits and costs should be allocated. Next slide, please, Terry. So next slide, please, Terry. In terms of use cases, this could be a conference by itself. And go back one slide, please, Terry. So in use cases, like I said, we developed 14 use cases and around the 7 to 8 themes around simple monomodal trips to more complex trips, late night trips, commuter models, and also how you actually perform end-to-end trip planning from the perspective of an operator, not only the interest of a passenger themselves. So which of these are most important? And that question remains with us as we start to assess the available data and visualize the weaknesses in transport provision at various locations and at various times of the day. Next slide, please, Terry. We're doing this through the establishment of working groups, and there are 4 working groups we've set up so far. We're actually in the process of setting up. One focusing on on-demand mobility services. Exchange Square PTI is a focus of many of those use cases. Regulation, which is cross-cutting, and environmental sustainability. At a low priority, although still critically important, we find that active mobility and first mile, last mile provisions, as well as operational integration, is equally important. So we're focusing on those 4 initially, and we certainly welcome your participation in any of those interest groups, if you wish. Next slide, please, Terry. So we have this concept called the TRP Knowledge Cafe. And so we have monthly, sometimes twice monthly demonstrations. And a demonstration is a private sector player, typically demonstrating a new product or service. And what it has done, it's invited the supply chain, including the transport operators, to actually have a 30-minute platform to expose their interests and to articulate innovations in transport. So everyone from that point should have an equal understanding of just what's available. The next step is to agree what's possible, of course, but at least having a common understanding of the contemporary methods is the initial starting point. Terry, over to you to wrap up on the next slide. Thank you.
I just want to say, in order to affect change in Hong Kong, it helps to have government support. And in our open collaboration approach with the university, anchoring that approach as the trusted third party, I see that as a fusion of a bottom-up and a top-down approach to address some of the institutional challenges that Andrew just covered. And it's with the Exchange Square PTI POC, we hope to unlock the data that currently resides in silos to build up that intermodal picture and to start creating the evidence that will lead to better informed policy and decision-making here in Hong Kong. Thank you very much. And there's a link for anyone who's interested in finding out more about our program and becoming a participant in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Back to you, Marina.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Terry. We can now move on to the next presentation, which is on multimodal approaches to bus transport. Can I please invite Zijen and Sharat, please?
Hi there. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I got the thumbs up. So hi, everybody. Thanks for letting us share our research with you guys. So we're working on a UGC-funded project on resilience of multimodal public transportation. And I'm an assistant professor at the School of Energy and Environment, and I have my PhD researcher, Shu, with me here. And together we'd be presenting this project that we have on resilience. So cities, let me see if I can, hold on, yeah. Cities are faced with all kinds of disruptive events, including extreme weather, technical failures, man-made attacks. These tend to have a significant impact on the public transportation system. And with climate change, these such large-scale disruptions are only going to become more frequent and intense. So it is imperative to design and operate urban public transit that is safe to fail and can bounce back from any kind of disruption. So this is unknown unknowns. The recent Future for Mobility report by We Ride Australia produced this graphic that highlights the impact of public transportation disruption on road congestion, right? A public transportation system that is not resilient will result in the displacement of passengers from more efficient modes to private vehicles, which will further reduce the ability of the transportation system to bounce back. In addition, resilient public transportation in cities can reduce the dependence of passengers on carbon-intensive independent vehicles, and therefore contribute to long-term sustainability. So that is primarily the reason why we're looking at resilience in the context of sustainability and environmental impacts. In Hong Kong, in particular, the public transportation system is efficient in terms of ridership volume, but this high passenger dependency also makes the system more vulnerable to disruptions. For this reason, our project, it has been funded by UGC, focuses on producing data-driven resilience analytics in the context of Hong Kong. So there is a need to design and operate the public transportation system, keeping resilience in mind. So the natural question is, well, how do we define resilience? Well, we use the definition that has been proposed by the National Academies of Sciences, which also is used by the US Department of Homeland Security. So the definition goes like this: resilience is the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. So the definition covers all the phases of disaster cycle. So that's both pre as well as post disruption. So this is sort of your disruption cycle. And so the preparedness phase focuses on identifying the sources of systemic vulnerability. Robustness is focused on, as soon as you have the disruption, the ability of the system to withstand the disruption and curtail the spread of that any cascading impacts. Recovery phase aims at identifying optimal strategies to respond to the disruption. And lastly, the adaptation phase is focused on learning from previous phases to improve the preparedness of the system for the next cycle. So this framework presents a comprehensive view of resilience, unlike other frameworks that we've had in the past that only looked at either just one mode or would only focus on one of these phases. So either they'd look at preparedness or recovery and call it resilience. So what we're trying to do is a very comprehensive study here. So now Shu will describe the model and a few applications of the resilience analytics that we are planning to develop.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Dr. Flora. Let me share my screen. Yeah. So I will briefly introduce the modeling approach of multimodal public transport and then show some of the use cases in our framework in different phases. So first, we model the transport systems as networks. So for multiple nodes, we understand them as a multi-layer network. And to connect different layers, we identify the intermodal nodes and edges. And for example, we have a map here near the Hong Ho MTR station, and the gray areas are buildings. And this building is integrating different transport services to be a public transport interchange, the PTI. So all nodes within the PTI can be combined to intermodal nodes. And there are also bus stops in the vicinity, which are accessible by several minutes walking on the street. Here we can introduce the intermodal edges. And then for the utility of the framework, let me show some of the use cases. And for preparedness, we are actually finding the source of vulnerability in the network. And take a metro network as an example. Here we show one of our indicators for vulnerability, the betweening centrality. You can simply understand it as the structural importance of the station to the entire network. And we rank the station by this metric to identify the top stations that are considered as source of vulnerability in the network. And the transit line between the stations are critical edges. The disruption on them have a significant impact on the network functionality. And the analysis is quite useful for planning. And also for the robustness, we examine whether the system can afford to fail. And through simulations, we plot the degradation curves. And with it, we can quickly know how much functionality will be lost in a certain level of disruption. And for example, with about 10% of stations in disruption, we will lose more than 40% of passenger flows in the network. Also, the curve can produce a score by integral. Then we can look into the temporal variation of the robustness scores in different time of the day, which can be useful for operators to manage the spread of the disruption. And for recovery phase, here I introduce one of the scenarios, the relocation of passengers. Simply, what we mean by relocation is whether the passengers can find an alternative of transport near a disrupted station. It's good for people if there's redundant accessibility to transport service. such relocation capability is quantified, and both commuters and operators can use the information to organize the redundant routes during a disruption event. And for the adaptation, it is understood in a planning way. When we plan to expand the infrastructure to serve more people, it's meaningful to also look at the change of system resilience. And during the examinations, we can identify the potential new connections in the network that can significantly improve the system resilience. And in addition, we can also look into the trade-offs between different indicators in terms of resilience that can be further integrated with the decision-making process. Okay, now I give it back to Dr. Shora.
Thank you. So you stop sharing your screen.
Oh, okay.
Can you share your screen again? Yeah, I just wanted to end by saying that currently the data that we're using to model our resilience analytics is the transport characteristic survey, which is quite outdated. And so we really encourage data sharing between various operators for enhancing and actually utilizing the resilience analytics that we've been developing. So thank you for having us, and this is all from us.
Great, thanks very much for that presentation. Can I please hand over to Dr. Sun Yi on active spaces?
Yes. Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James and Marina, for having me here to introduce this humble work about the active open spaces and how and why active open spaces is quite important for future populations against the background of population aging in Hong Kong. And my name is Sun Yi, and I come from the Polytechnic Universities, and I was trained as an urban planner. So very simple, my research is to look into how the changes of built environment can have a positive bearings on older people in terms of encouraging their physical activities, social interactions, and as well as their good mood. So this project is actually funded by the Public Policy Research Funding Scheme from the Policy Innovation and Coordination Office from the Hong Kong government. And I focus my study in Hong Kong, and I think this background information is very important for, in particular for planners. So we need to be very sensitive to the high density urban environment context in Hong Kong. And currently we have 7.5 million populations. And I did a simple calculations in Hong Kong because we only have 25% of land are built up areas. That means per kilometer, the land accommodate more than 26,000 persons. So the planning and design for active open spaces or any planning initiatives for walkabilities, public spaces should be aware of these high density situations. And I was enlightened by this City of Wellbeing map, and this has been introduced by one of my colleagues in UK, who argued that the people's well-being is not only affected by people themselves, but through a nested geographies ranging from their immediate environments, such as community and neighborhood, to the built environment, natural environment, and even global system at large. So the changes of built environment is able to affect or inform activities at an inner scale, which will finally affect the lifestyles of people and which will ultimately change the lifestyles and have a great impact on people's health and well-being. So built environment matters, and particularly for high density city like Hong Kong, the characteristics of built environment or placemaking plays a very important role in facilitate citizens' health and active living styles, lifestyles. I define my focus of studies specifically on the older people because currently in Hong Kong, more than 70% of population are age 65 and above. And if you take a look at this figure, it indicates that when people become older, chances that they have acute diseases become lower, and more risk factors come from environment. For example, frailty, falls, fractures, so on and so forth. So the change or the environment, older people become very sensitive to the change of environment as they age. And before I start, I talk a little bit on the theory part. And I borrow my insight from this person environment fit series, which generally talks about the co-constitution about older people and environment in making a good life. Here, environment include both the physical environment and social environment, and the certain characteristics of the environment can have implications for people, in particular older people, in terms of their willingness to do physical activities, in terms of willingness to socialize, also in terms of enhancement of their psychological well-being. So environment and people themselves are co-constituted. When we talk about aging in place, we are talking about planning age-friendly cities and communities in Hong Kong. We should focus on the one hand, the characteristics of the environment, on the other hand, and people their own competence. And in this study, I give examples here. When people are young, they are very energetic, they have full competence, and they live in a simple community. So the community can fulfill people's needs when they are young. So when people get old, their competence may decline. So the same environment setting may not be able to produce or satisfy the needs of people when they get old. So they comes to this malfunction range. So what planners should do, I think what we should do is try the ways to provide environmental stimuli so that older people, we can recreate a person environmental fit. Okay, so this is the basic ideas, conceptual framework I have in designing this research. So when it talks about person environment fit, we talk about good environmental characteristics, and we talk about people's own competence. And existing literature we review suggests that place attachment is one of the very important personally owned competence. Think about if people living in regional communities for more than 3 or 4 decades, he or she will be very familiar with where to get the resources. She or he psychologically will have a strong feelings of embeddedness in that community. And chances are that people, when they are getting old, they are willing to, or they tend to continuously maintain their active interaction with the environment. So here I argue that apart from good environmental factors, place attachment, place satisfactions are some of the important people-oriented competence that constitute to aging well and constitute to older people's health and well-being. And I will use a pilot studies in Tsuen Wan because it's a first generation new towns, which is currently under a consequent trend of urban renewal. And we do a mixed method research. And in this study, we do the questionnaire we do the questionnaire research plus semi-structured interviews. And in the interest of time, I will highlight some of the important findings we have. The first thing is that we found built environment factors, including the buildings, community facilities, and social environment can predict place attachment. That means if building is well maintained, if there is a diversity of community facilities, or if the places is socially rich, that means the place is able to provide sufficient open spaces for people to socialize and interact. These kind of characteristics are conducive to the development of place attachment for older people. And second thing is that, very interesting, seeing the greening or feeling the quietness of the space is not enough for producing place attachment. We find it's very interesting because in general, people will think that we provide sufficient amount of greening and we make the place quiet enough for people to stay and to enjoy themselves is very important. However, this kind of place characteristics do not have powerful effects to improve the place attachment. Third, when talks about place attachment, older people seems to be more appreciated in terms of the utilization of the place. That means people are more likely to appreciate the usefulness of the place in supporting their daily life than place identity. What does that mean? Place identity means an extension of self-identity. That means place an individual in a place and develop a self-identity. And in this case, we find that older people in Hong Kong develops more instrumental values about place. That means they tend to, when they have place attachment, they tend to explore the usefulness of a place. Then it's not easy, it's not difficult to imagine why seeing or staying closely with nature is not powerful enough to produce place attachment for older people in Hong Kong. So a planning and design needs to consider a variety of community facilities, and more importantly, these facilities, these open spaces should be active enough to encourage people to have social interactions, to do physical activities, to develop or to trigger their willingness to explore the resources in a place. Having said that, it seems like being active is very important, in particularly against a high density context in Hong Kong. So that highlights the importance of why promotion of workability is of considerable priorities for Hong Kong's planning and for Hong Kong's planners as well. And we do a simple calculations by using the data from the statistics and using the data from the land use data. And we calculate a workability index using a similar formula adapted from the United States and European countries. The reasons why we use this standardized formula is because we want to have an international comparison of the extent to which Hong Kong is positioned in terms of the promotion of workability. So the higher score is, the higher levels of workability a unique areas get. So in this figure, you will see that the old downtown areas and Hong Kong Island have the highest level of workability, whereas the new towns and the island areas seems to have relatively lower levels of workability. But we try to do some interviews with planners and government officials in planning department to understand the reasons why, and we find that zoning matters. In the old urban downtown areas and Kowloon, the zoning is quite fragmented and the scale of each zone is quite smaller. That is to facilitate a very compact development with mixed land use to enhance the efficiency of socio-economic activities as well as traveling and daily commute. Whereas in new towns, there is a trend of gardens influenced by a trend of garden cities, influenced by a change in planning paradigms in Hong Kong to promote public civic squares. So the zonings for the scale for each zone is relatively larger. That's the reasons why the land use mix become lower. The reasons why land use mix is important is because when we calculate workability index, land use mix, residential density, and road connectivity are three important indicators we have. Behind this thing, it seems like old urban areas doing quite well in terms of the promotion of workability, whereas the new towns seems to lag a little bit behind in terms of promotion of workability. However, we find that it's not because people deliberatively create a mixed land use for enhancing the workability in Hong Kong. It is because the planning paradigms in different period of time, although in new towns, the scale for each zoning is larger, but because of this larger zone, we have spaces for recreational facilities, we have land for open spaces for greening. So it's always the checks and balances. So I think this is the preliminary studies we have so far. And I think in the future, it is more important to identify if people living in this objectively measured high workability area do have a higher willingness to work or do review a higher behavior change to work instead of using automobiles. Studies from United States and European countries has demonstrated that this objectively measured workability index can reflect the real behaviors of people when they work in their own communities. So we hope to demonstrate whether or not this is a similar trend in Hong Kong, so that planners can simply use this workability index as a workability assessment tools for future urban renewal and new towns development. As a conclusion, I think placemaking is very important. Equally important is people's lived experiences in cities. We're planning cities for people. So people's life and livelihood, people's well-being is very important. And planning is thus a matter of life and death. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sun Yi, for that very insightful presentation there. I think we're out of time for Q&A, unfortunately, so I might just hand back to James to carry on with the next session.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Thanks, that's great. Yes, we did try to pack in quite a lot into that one session, so thanks for handling all that. And if there's any questions, people can always email us and we'll follow up with the panelists there. So thank you, Marina. Okay. So now we're moving on to our, now we're going to move on to our next session. Excuse us one moment. Okay, now we have Paul Bromley and Alok Jain, and we're going to be talking about buses. So to start us off, Paul, who's Managing Director of Phoenix Business Consulting, will be giving us a presentation. So I'm going to make him the spotlight. There we are. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that, James, and thank you for the invitation for speaking today. Just let me hit the right. Okay. Oops. Okay. Is that clear to it? Is that clear, James? Is that is that working fine? Okay. Today I just want to talk about new paradigms in bus transit, for sustainable bus transit. Now, obviously, you know, we've been having fossil fuel vehicles for over 100 years now. And so we have to look at this whole thing, this paradigm. It's obviously a buzzword at the moment. And I did look it up. I checked the definition the other day, and it did say, you know, it's a distinct set of concepts and thought patterns. Well, to me, that's received wisdom, or to paraphrase in some regards, it's saying, this is the way we've always done it. Well, if that were the case, you know, Hong Kong's had sustainable transport for over 100 years. And it's not my 1912 electric bus from South Shields, or my hybrid bus from 2013, or even the electric buses that are on trial at the moment. No, it's the trams. So that is a sustainable mode of transport. So acceptability of a sustainable transport is already inbred into Hong Kong. Now, given that we've got limited time today, I'll skip my usual history lesson onto why we've ended up where we've ended up, and just jump to the point that we want to make things sustainable, but you know, there are barriers to electric vehicle adoption. Now, there has been a number of surveys done, and this is one, it's a couple of years old now, but I keep bringing it up again. But it clearly highlights the three primary concerns of electric vehicle adoption. And the three are cost, distance traveled, i.e. range anxiety, and availability of chargers. So what I'd like to do today is just to address those top 3 points as to how, you know, what we can do in order to make it a more acceptable solution to move those paradigms. The first thing I'll talk about is cost of operation, because this is always a fear. Now, it may not be a surprise to you, but actually the Hong Kong franchise bus operators only pay around $4 a litre for their diesel fuel, because the tax is removed on the quid pro quo that they use the zero emissions sulfur diesel, zero sulfur diesel. Now, okay, in fact, I think it's actually slightly less than that at the moment, because obviously we're in a time of distressed oil prices. But I'll just take that as a simple figure to start with. And typically, a Hong Kong bus does 80,000 kilometers a year. Now that's, some do more than that, you know, particularly the airport buses do at least half as much again. but typically urban fuel economy on those vehicles is about 1.5 kilometers per litre of fuel. So they're going to burn $200,000 worth of fuel every year. So that's an inherent cost to operating a fossil fueled bus. When you look at an electric bus, well, if I were to buy electricity off CLP, I'd be paying 98 cents per kilowatt hour. And on the same basis of using the same distance per year per vehicle. And extrapolating, I've worked on single deck electric buses before, but not a double deck, but extrapolating that for a double deck, fully air conditioned bus would work on something like about 0.6 kilometers per kilowatt hour. And the implication there on that price of electricity and that consumption is you're going to use half, it's going to cost you half as much again as a fossil fuel vehicle to operate an electric bus. Now, there's even further benefits to be involved because below those price lines, you'll see, you know, when you've got a fossil fueled vehicle, you've got brake pads to change, oil filters, air filters, you know, all that engine maintenance, cooling systems, radiators, topping up with coolant. Electric vehicles have an electric motor and nothing else. Now, a good electric vehicle also has uses regenerative braking, and so actually you get a lower brake life. About, in my experience, about half the brake life of a fossil fueled vehicle. So you're actually saving on your maintenance costs by running an electric bus. Now, maintenance costs versus the fuel costs, probably 20% of the overall operating costs at most, if you take drivers out of the equation. So on cost of operation argument, electric buses, you know, they stand up for themselves. Well, the other aspect of cost is what does a new vehicle cost? The biggest inherent cost in an electric vehicle is the batteries. And I will come back onto that later, just so we can just bear that thought. Now, we did talk about, apart from cost, we talked about range. That's the next worry on vehicles. Now, historically, people have always had this range anxiety issue. So, you know, shortened range up here in the top left-hand corner here. So if you've got shortened range, how do I improve my range? I add more batteries. What does that do? That increases my weight. That uses more energy. So that's going to shorten my range again. So we get into this vicious cycle of a high capital cost. And this is historically where e-buses have been. It's like we'll put a lot of energy on board the vehicle, and that ensures that we can run the vehicle the whole day. You know, a typical diesel bus operation runs, you know, from 6 in the morning till 12 at night, and then it goes and tops up with fuel and it's ready for the next day. So people have just sort of kept that same sort of thinking with electric buses. So it needs to start to address what's going wrong here. So if we try and break that paradigm, and I'll start in the bottom left corner here, and we'll say, okay, well, if we did have less batteries, that means it's lighter weight. If we're lighter weight, we'll get a bigger range for the same weight, for the same energy. And that's obviously going to reduce your energy consumption. So we get into a better circle this way. So we're starting to look at reducing batteries. And this is going to lead to a lower capital cost. I touched on the cost earlier, but there's also, we look at the range. But therefore, that just leaves us with a big question: how to reduce the batteries? So what are the technologies available? Well, as I say, the world is moving on. There are technologies available. They're readily available today and being tried all around the world. But I'll just for brevity today, I'll focus on three or four technologies that can deliver this. First one is what I call in-motion charging. As you can see there, that's using a catenary as an overhead charge. Second is hydrogen fuel cells, which you've all heard about. And the third is we just stick with the battery electric vehicle model. There's what's called opportunity charging, and then there's what's called battery swapping. So just to touch on each of those in a little more detail, in-motion charging is actually the modern trendy name for what we used to know as trolley buses. Any of you who've been to Vancouver will have seen trolley buses on the streets there. They have them in parts of Shanghai, typically going underneath the flyovers, where they use the underside of the flyover for the electrical catenary. This is very, very similar to trams, but it's even better because it's more flexible. And also with today's modern technology, you can have a little bit of battery on board. So even if you had to go off of the catenary, you can take a detour and come back on it again fairly quickly. And these things are particularly suited for things like BRT, which bus rapid transit, dedicated busways, which I know the Hong Kong government is not in favour of. So a next solution is a hydrogen fuel cell. Now, I've been in this business for over 30 years now, and hydrogen fuel cells are always the next best thing. But in reality, they are actually a very good solution, and the price of them is now coming down to a comparable level, where a hydrogen fuel cell is comparable to a diesel engine with all its emissions equipment. The only thing then is you have to supply the hydrogen to it. But the output of these is you still have an exhaust pipe and there's still some smoke come out of it, but it is actually just H2O. It's a very, very straightforward technology. Hydrogen has a very high energy density, which means with just a few gas tanks on the roof, you can drive for more than one day. And as I say, it fills up in 10 minutes, just like fossil fuels. The only issue one would say with any of these is that you have to consider where your hydrogen is being produced from. And it needs to be by sustainable methods, because up until recently, the majority of hydrogen is either through steam methane reformation, which rips the carbon out of gas, takes the hydrogen out of gas and sticks the carbon, just blows the carbon into the atmosphere. So that's not very environmentally friendly. Or reverse electrolysis, which is basically taking electricity to make hydrogen to make electricity. So there's an efficiency loss there. Now, one of my favorite topics is rapid charging, or opportunity charging as it's called. There's two ways of doing this. You can either have it as an overhead pantograph, as in the picture in the bottom left corner there, or you can have an underfloor inductive charging, which is the picture in the middle there, which just has some pads over the floor. There's some receiver coils underneath the bus, and the charge is just passed in the same way that you can now charge your mobile phone, just by placing it on a plate. But this enables you to charge the vehicles very rapidly. And what I have illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide here is that opportunity charging, you can charge sort of 3, 4, 5 times a day, and you can reduce the amount of batteries you need. You can, because you don't need to have all of that capacity as required in the bottom graph that you can see, that you need a massive capacity just to run the whole day. So that's one good way of reducing batteries on a battery electric vehicle. The other way is battery swapping. And this is a newish technique. It's been used in Beijing. It's currently on trial in Hyderabad in India. But this basically looks at you take a vehicle and you have an automated battery swap system. There's no human intervention, so it should be absolutely, it's totally friendly. It won't have any accidents. It's in a controlled environment. A couple of the downsides is, as you can see from the nice graphics there, it does take up a little bit of real estate, but it also leads us to breaking another paradigm in the way that we have to consider the battery power, because obviously the batteries change from one vehicle to the next. Basically a vehicle gets a new battery, goes out, drives around, and a pack of typically around about 20 batteries stay at the station, each get charged up slowly, and then another bus comes along and takes that battery. So the batteries don't stay with the same bus all the time. So it starts to get us thinking more and more about how the batteries are owned. How are we paying for diesel fuel? Who's putting in the infrastructure? And this is really where we're going to break through on this, because everyone's worried about, if I buy a battery electric vehicle, what happens when the battery runs out? Do I have to pay a lot of money to replace it? So we have to start to think about models whereby there are third-party ownership of the charging solution. And whether that's installing a rapid charge station, whether that's installing a battery swap station, and basically the operators pay on a power by the hour is the buzzword for it. So you pay typically however many kilowatt hours of energy you've consumed, that's what you pay for. The same way that you pay so much for a litre of diesel fuel or petroleum spirit. So it starts to break down those paradigms. So I'm very conscious that I'm taking up a lot of time and we have been running late. So if I can just sort of quickly summarize, where we get with these paradigm shifts. So the first thing I would say is there's no single universal solution that meets every requirement. And it is very much horses for courses. I talked about fuel cell buses. Fuel cells actually work quite well on commercial vehicles. They do not work very well on passenger vehicles, for example. There is a scale to them. And in the same vein, it's necessary to consider the best possible solutions for the operational need. Now, the battery charging or refueling infrastructure, as I just touched on, we need to think about that differently than today. If I had a petrol car and I went to the petrol station, I don't own the petrol station. I don't own the fuel pump. I buy the fuel by a volume. So why don't we do that with battery charging similarly? We take the risk away from the operator. So they don't own the battery, but they're paying by how many kilowatt hours that they are consuming. I mean, the vehicle operations, well, now when we talk about different charging solutions, we now get into the more technical aspects of where do we charge? I talk about rapid charging on buses, and the typical way of doing that is doing it at bus termini, say Star Ferry Pier or whatever. Now that's quite easy, it won't obstruct anything, but that moves me on to my final point really, is that needs to be agreed. And again, if we're using a third party to put in that infrastructure, they take that commercial risk. So we're not asking governments to input large sums of money to put in a refueling or recharging infrastructure, because that risk will be borne by the third party energy supplier. But what it does need is these solutions I've just outlined are cost effective, they are sustainable, but it does require a collective will from both the operators to go with it and test the logic for themselves, prove it to themselves, but also the government to facilitate the supporting infrastructure. And I'm not saying the government have to make huge investments into the infrastructure, but just allow me to go and put up a few overhead pantograph recharging at Star Ferry or wherever. Before I say too much about what the government, I would make one final positive on the government. They are actually at this moment looking at doing a trial on minibus charging, on overhead pantograph minibus charging at the new CBD in Kwun Tong. So that is a positive, but that's something that, if we want a fully sustainable city, then we need to roll that out further. So I think that's it covers most of my points, and I'll pass back to Alok for any questions and his thoughts on the matter.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. And there's a lot of questions been coming in. So I think what we'll do first is have Alok come and make a short presentation.
I don't have a presentation, James. Yeah.
Okay. And then we can answer some of these questions. So I'm just going to hand over to Alok for a moment. Okay. Hello, Alok. Welcome.
Thank you, James. So I'm going to keep it short because I know a lot of people have said a lot of things, and I think a lot of issues that I wanted to talk about has been covered. But a couple of issues which we still haven't covered, and I think those are quite important in context of Hong Kong. One is technology. I think from a technology implementation perspective, Hong Kong has really taken a back seat. We have not really gone for a lot of upgrades in the sense that at the back-end efficiency level, the things are still being done manually. Hong Kong is probably the only place where the bus companies run a profitable operation, and yet very few of them, not all of them, even use a scheduling software, which is one of the if you look at European operations, that is probably one of the foremost requirement for even the smallest bus operations. You look at Australia, it's exactly that requirement, but here there is no imposition as such. From a regulatory perspective, there is a lot of regulation in Hong Kong. It's a very light touch regulation, so there's a whole gap here. So we operate a net cost model where people come in and there is a, I would say, room for innovation. People can improve their systems, generate efficiency, and capture those efficiencies as profit. So government allows you to do that. But then if you look at the franchise agreements, they are so tight. And between this room, between your PBSO, the Public Bus Services Ordinance, your RTO, Road Traffic Ordinance, and the actual franchise agreements, there is so much room to play by the government that sometimes those clarity for the operators don't exist. So that allows for a lot of discretionary intervention, and to some extent, I would say, subdues the innovation aspects in public transport operation. So something that we should address from a policy perspective, allow that room, allow long-term investment into improving the system rather than just doing the BAU, business as usual. Second aspect that I want to address is a fundamental policy issue. So yes, I mean, we talked about design thinking, isochrones, and all these things. And I will start by saying, giving one example. If you look at Cross Harbor Tunnel in the morning peak 3 hours, 80% of the traffic, the people, 80% of people use 10% of the vehicles to cross that tunnel. And those 10% of the vehicles are buses, double-deck buses. So, and what does it, is there any priority for buses on these tunnels? No, we don't have a lane mark for them. Singapore, if you look at, in Singapore, if there are any roads in Singapore which has more than 2 lanes and they do 40 buses per hour, they allocate that lane, that one lane as a bus lane in Singapore. And all the buses in Singapore, they are equipped with cameras. And if there are any violations or into the bus lanes, the bus driver can take a picture and it is a completely enforceable offense. In Hong Kong, we are on a completely opposite end. We, as a matter of policy, take very conservative approach in allocating space for vehicles and buses. During my work with KMB, I can tell you from 2012 to 2015, the traffic speeds on most of the major urban corridors reduced by 10 to 12%. Now that's a huge impact on bus operation if you see, because to run exactly the same services, you require 10 to 12% more buses, more drivers, and obviously your journey times are much longer, which is not very attractive to the customers. So if we want to promote public transport in a city, we do have to impose, I would say, fundamentally, in a way, draconian policies to control the private cars. And if you see the private cars, and James, if you recall, I sent you a chart earlier, some time ago, where if you divide the time between 2009 to 2015, last 15 years or so, our car growth rate, the private car licensed private car growth rate has gone up in a geometric progression. So in the first 5 years, they were 1.2% growth. The second 5 year is 2.4% growth. And the last 5 years have been almost 5% growth. So this is completely unsustainable. And a lot of parking problems that we are talking about, congestion problems that we are highlighting, and all those are happening because of the unchecked growth in private cars on our road. We just simply do not have the space for those. Hong Kong is also one of the cities which has very limited amount of road space, urban space allocated for roads, only 13%. Compare that with Singapore, which has roughly 24, 25% of the urban space allocated to roads. If you look at United States cities, they have 35, 40% allocation to road space. So we simply do not have the space to accommodate all these cars, no matter what we do. And so this is something that we have to address. We need to make policies and create space on the roads for public transport. And that's the only way the city can keep moving. Otherwise, there is absolutely no choice. So with that, I will be happy to have an open discussion, James. And
yeah,
one more thing I will supplement on Paul's presentation is Paul. Yeah, we talked about a few technologies, but one thing in Hong Kong is that out of 600, some 700 routes in Hong Kong, 50% of the routes, they are no longer than 10 kilometers. They are just feeder routes to the railway stations, right? For the feeder routes to railway stations, a lot of things, I mean, you addressed a lot of range anxiety issues, but those issues do not really come into play for almost 50% of the bus routes. And so supercapacitors as currently being used on in Shatin and one route in Kaitak. Supercapacitors are, in my opinion, are also one of the very good solution for this short distance routes. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, supercapacitors they're good for very short distances, but they have very little reserve capacity, is what I would say. So you're right in what you're saying. On a 10-kilometer route, they work very well. I didn't show all the solutions, I have to admit, because we're time limited. But supercapacitors work well in a very short route, but if you suddenly get a traffic jam, they'll run out.
Yeah.
If you remember the one that ran between Top Depot and HQ, only on a 5-kilometer route, I'll say no.
We've got a question from our friend Patrick at Clean Air Network. Well, 3 questions, but we're running out of time. So just a quick 30-second answer from you both. Who should lead this? Now, we've heard a lot of bottom-up in the earlier presentations, but when it comes to buses and bus routes, we can't really have a bottom-up approach, or can we? It must come from government. What's your views on that?
Well, in my opinion,
first. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Who wants to go first? Paul, go first.
It's both. I mean, government policy is restricting on the infrastructure because, as Alex mentioned about the supercap buses in Sha Tin, it was devil's own job to get the charging facility put in place, and that's delayed the whole project by years, literally years. So that's where the government fits in. It's not about giving subsidy, it's about facilitating the infrastructure. That is policy between all the government, align all the government departments. From an operator standpoint, the solutions I present, they just need to try them themselves and demonstrate to themselves that they are cost effective.
So my view here, James, is that government, Hong Kong is done very well that way, that we have had less government and we have opened a lot of room for private enterprise to provide fantastic services. Hong Kong public transport is one of the most efficient public transport systems around the world. So there is no doubt that people here are doing a great job. But having said that, the enabling framework for a lot of these changes to happen is something that the government has to initiate. They need to create a platform. They need to create that window of opportunity for people to come in and make those changes happen. Unfortunately, most of our regulation is extremely archaic and very old. And simple thing is, you showed a lot of pictures of cars on the footpath, but have you tried sending them and using them as enforcement? And you will know the answer. Our ordinances do not allow them those kind of pictures as admissible evidence in the court. So I think these are the simple things. If you look at Korea, almost entirely the entire parking enforcement is actually the vision technology based, and they have done a fantastic job. Singapore, even before all this high tech stuff came, they had these aunties who did entire parking enforcement in Singapore, and they are just overzealous aunties, and they make these roads clear in Singapore. We have done neither of those, and we rely totally on Hong Kong police, whose attention is certainly not on parking at the moment.
Yeah, I have become an auntie, actually. I'm out there with my camera. And okay, guys, it's been a pleasure, and we could talk for hours, but we have to move on, I'm afraid. So thank you very much to you both.
Thank you, James.
And we'll speak again soon. Okay,
yeah.
Thanks. Okay. So now, okay, so now we're moving on. We've discussed the sort of 6 wheels and the buses, and now we're moving on to 2 wheels or 2 legs. And we have the chairman of the Hong Kong Cycling Alliance to kick off with some ideas about cycling and why not Hong Kong. So let me just transition to this. There we go. This is Martin. Welcome.
Hi everybody. Yeah, Martin Turner from Hong Kong Cycling Alliance. We're a campaigning organisation. We try to make a lot of noise. We try to point people to look at the possibilities for cycling to serve Hong Kong better. It's about how cycling can be a part of the transport network, the transport system, as well as sport and leisure and so on. But transport's a focus. I often spend a lot of time trying to persuade people what a wonderful solution cycling is. A lot of concerns are raised, and the same concerns are raised, and I have simple answers for them. But I've got a different proposition today, and that's that the government, as well as academics else in Hong Kong, but particularly the government, haven't done the basic research, the basic data gathering to provide a platform for a realistic consideration of what cycling can do for Hong Kong as part of the transport mix. We should, I believe, investigate and experiment with what cycling can do. And I'm welcoming anybody who can tell me why we shouldn't look, why when the rest of the world over the last 15 to 20 years has taken up cycling, integrated it, experimented a lot in China, in Singapore, Taiwan, our neighbours, Europe, the US, South America. All of them have, in lots and lots of different ways, found a role for cycling and developed it. Part of it's top down, part of it is people with their own initiatives and individually getting on a bike and riding it. It's not complicated. In the last 8 months or so, we've had an extra rush as cities especially, but countries too, have taken up cycling as part of social distancing, allocating entire lanes to cyclists which weren't there before, as well as, of course, enabling more social distancing for pedestrians and other street use. There are low traffic neighbourhoods in London. There's cyclovia in car-free days in Bogota. There's a new cycle lane laid down the main congested artery through Manila. These aren't places that have a tradition of cycling. Paris has taken up under the new mayor cycling and walking. Again, Paris didn't have the kind of cycling tradition that people associate with Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And those places didn't have a cycling tradition before the 1970s, which is the sort of nadir of all this. So where are we? What's our starting position for Hong Kong? In fact, there's a lot of cycling in Hong Kong. A lot of people ride bikes. And some of it's for leisure, some of it's for transport. We don't really know quite what the split is. Transport Department will have us believe, and have done for many years, that cycling is basically for leisure. For a long time, there was no consideration of, or no recognition of transport. Even now, with all due respect to our Transport Department friends here today with us, I don't experience when I meet people there's any real taking on board of what cycling does as part of the transport system. It's mentioned as something that happens in the new towns on the cycle tracks. So Transport Department is the key to all this, because other departments follow them in terms of how cycling is approached. There's lots of cycling in Hong Kong. You can go out, you can see it, you can look at government data and say, oh yes, parts of the new territories, rural areas have 30–40% modal share for cycling. And then there are all those cycle tracks in the new towns. In the urban areas, people ride bikes. All those chickens and gas canisters that get delivered are by people riding bikes. They're not supermen or women. They are just people who know that you can get on a bike and get around. So there is cycling in Hong Kong, and we shouldn't overlook the fact that we're already there. This isn't an idea for the future. The policy for cycling is definitely unsupportive. It's about not supporting cycling in the urban areas, not actually doing anything for cycling on roads. It's seen as a leisure activity on the cycle tracks. That's got to change. I would just like to sidetrack slightly and give myself as an example. There are many people who currently ride a lot in the urban areas to get around, and it really works. It's simple, it's fast, it's effective. You reduce the number of journeys you make, you get to where you want to be. There's a certainty. Isochrones are circular because you just go where you want to go, and there's no allowance for traffic jams other than the basic built-in. It's about 20% for traffic lights and so on over a clear run. Resilience, yep, no problem. There's a hold up, the road's closed, you can go a different way. And so, although cycling right now is not for everyone, and that's the point of Hong Kong Cycling Alliance, we're trying to make it available for a much wider audience. The proof of concept is there. Cycling gets around. If I'm wanting to get over to North Wan Chai across the Gloucester Road, I have to break the law to cross one of the bridges there because there are no legal links, but the roads work. The network of roads that's established and is so much in the way of being a pedestrian, cramping pedestrians behind railings onto these narrow rat runs we call pavements. On a bicycle, you get the benefit of the small mobile vehicle and the network of roads that gets you quickly anywhere. So we've got to take that proof of concept and make it work for much larger numbers of people and integrate it into how we get around. That's what my organisation is trying to do. I get back to my main point. Why aren't we doing the research? Why isn't there experimentation? Perhaps I should be doing it with my group, but the government should be doing it. Let's have a couple down here. No. Okay. So we're already popular, and this is perhaps the way that Transport Department sees cyclists. It's certainly, this is from one of their leaflets, and it's how it comes across when I deal with Transport Department officials. They think of cyclists as beginners, wobbly, incompetent, thoughtless, can't make a decision on, for instance, whether they can cope with a particular slope or not. Hence, advocacy from Transport Department to ban cyclists from this slope or that road. Is this our government's cycling policy? There is a severe problem of the government taking 10,000 to 20,000 bikes a year from where they're parked and destroying them. It seems to breach reasonableness and the basic law, but that's what happens. If your vehicle is parked somewhere where one of the government departments who are involved, there are 4 or 5, they will take the bike and just either sell it for scrap or crunch it up on the spot. It doesn't happen to a car owner. And there is, of course, in the parking regulations, the freedom for a bicycle owner to park their bike anywhere that's not causing danger or actual obstruction. Again, another issue, the government will prosecute you or threaten or remove the bike under a different law, such as the Occupation of Government Lands Ordinance. A lot of this comes down to space. So the issues that we're discussing here today of how we make use of the limited urban space we have are used against cycling. There's a reaction that, oh, there isn't enough space for bikes. And sometimes that means people are envisaging hard infrastructure of segregated cycleways. Sometimes there's just a thought about the physical space of the bike itself. There's an underlying assumption there that somehow people who are getting around on bikes are an addition to the transport mix and not not substituting for other modes, whether that's motor vehicles or public transport. And then there are many other factors as well, such as the reduced number of journeys you need to make. If you're on a bike, you can stop off at this shop, the library, see a friend, all in one journey, and you don't have to go out at the weekend after your MTR journey home to go and buy whatever it was you have to from that other shop. So there are many ways in which cycling can, interesting. Many ways in which cycling can take us forward in the transport sphere.
Okay.
So the data that we have is very, very limited. Again, Transport Department are at the heart of this, and we see, we don't know how many bikes there are. You know, the number of bikes in Hong Kong is an open question, and I get asked this, and I can't give a straight answer. Every 10 years, the Travel Characteristics Survey says how many households have bikes available, but the data is unreliable because it comes from a very broad household survey of people who rode a bike in the last 3 months. The annual studies by the Transport Department have no mention of cycling at all. The traffic census. The data that we want might be, for instance, how much more cycling there is at particular locations over a period of time. So this looks like a good graph, but it's from New York. What I'd like to note here is that New York City was gathering the data of how much cycling was taking place 20 years before the upsurge in cycling participation from 1980. Why aren't we doing the same thing? I guess that's probably a good place to end.
Okay. All right, thank you, Martin, and we can have more. Actually, we had a quick question from Alok, is why are bikes not allowed to be carried on buses?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, bikes can be carried on the MTR, on all services. This was announced informally at a meeting with MTR and bike organisations, cycling organisations, but it's never been published or explained clearly. And then there's this added expectation, again, not written down, that somehow a wheel should be removed for reasons that are never clear. Buses, we get stuck with a variation of the 0.1 cubic meters general baggage rule. So basically, if you've got a bike that is less than 0.1 cubic meters, then they're not going to object. But why should they? Because it's already meeting the baggage requirements, and that would be a Brompton, by the way, the only bike available that meets the requirement.
Okay. We now have Justin Yim, who's the founder of Hong Kong Street Reset, and is actually in the UK working for Phil Jones and Associates. And hi, Justin, can you hear us?
Hi.
And you're going to make a brief presentation, I understand.
Yes. Let me share my screen. Can you hear me well? Does it have echoes and? Yep. So today I would be talking about urban cycling infrastructure. I'll start off with the mindset behind planning of cycle infrastructure and run through some key interventions that we can do to our roads to make cycling safer and more attractive. So before to start off with that, we should talk about the space inefficiency of cars, obviously. So a moving car takes about 28 times more space than a moving bicycle, and 10 times more than a parked bicycle. So this is from the Netherlands Institute of Transport Policy Analysis in 2018. It shows that why cycling could be something that we should really consider, especially in a dense environment with insufficient road space, because it's a more efficient mode of transport than private car. So in the UK, where I'm based now, has been stepping up on cycling after years of realizing this immense socioeconomic and health benefit of it. The key mindset of it is we should treat cycling as truly like vehicles. They deserve direct and joined up routes. Points requiring cyclists to dismount should be avoided, and cycling infrastructure should be designed only by those who have experience on the road as cyclists. It's the network, but not just the links on the left-hand side that we should think about. A true interconnected network should have about 400 meters safe cyclable links within every 1 square kilometer space in a street network. And there are 5 core principles in designing a good, usable, attractive network for cycling. It should be coherent. Cyclists should be able to start and end their journeys with a high quality route that is consistent and easy to navigate. And by safe, we're talking about cycle network that not only improve their actual safety, but also their feeling of how safe the environment is. So notably, you can see on the direct column of this diagram, there's a don't section talk about this track requires cyclists to give way on each side road. And if the route requires many stopping and starting, it will result in some cyclists just choosing to ride on the main carriageway instead of a safer track, which is exactly what's happening in Hong Kong. So it's about prioritizing sustainable modes over cars, over the less safe space efficient private vehicles. On the left-hand side, we can see New York City, which cycling is a solution rather than a problem in a dense, similarly dense, high density built environment. And on the right-hand side, we can see London, which have been learning from Dutch and Nordic countries and have been producing planning and design guidances that works with the British road design. And Hong Kong embodying the unique things from both, we might be able to benefit from a hybrid model mixing the two. The failure of providing a safe cycling infrastructure has cost us the lives of 46 cyclists during the year of 2017 and 2013 and 17. And according to research, because more than 80% of them died on the carriageway without physical separation. Urban cycling is unsafe in Hong Kong, mostly only because of lack of infrastructure. And how do we make it safe? This hierarchy of control diagram was originated from the field of occupational health and safety. It explains cycling safety approach in Hong Kong very well. We are stuck at the control of process, focusing merely on the education and enforcement against cyclists in urban areas. We're not retrofitting urban roads to provide and improve cycling conditions using the engineering approach, which is above that, which is more effective than the other. It's the engineering approach that we need the most to truly protect cyclists. So in the UK, we have seen the completion of the first protected signalized junction in Manchester and the first Dutch-style roundabout in Cambridge. Both of them are designed to minimize conflicts between cyclists and vehicles at junctions, separating them mainly through the delineation of space. But separation not only works with space, but also time. Here it shows animation of an early release signal for cyclists in London. Cyclists are given a head start for about 4 seconds, which are proven to minimize collision risk at junctions, especially for those who are turning left. However, certainly not all routes could be covered in the foreseeable future with major high quality segregated cycle lanes. So we should also try to provide a relatively safe and cyclable connections between the major routes. According to WHO research, pedestrians are shown to have 90% of survival if they are struck by a car at 30 km/h speed. However, this chance of survival reduces to only about 30% when they are struck by a car at the speed of 50 kilometers per hour, which is the current default speed limit in urban areas and rural areas, even in Hong Kong. This fatality risk applies similarly to cyclists. Therefore, 30 kilometer per hour speed limit should be set as the norm on urban streets. This will not only protect cyclists, but also more for pedestrians even. And 42% of London's road network have now been enacting this 30 kilometer per hour speed limit. And the low speed environment could be achieved through these kind of changes to the road layout, such as narrowing the carriageway, adding speed tables, and tightening corner radii. But ultimately, we could also explore the concept of filtered permeability. On one hand, to protect cyclists by providing a low traffic streets environment, but also to minimize and reduces the convenience of motor vehicles to truly make our streets human first rather than vehicle first. So the gist of it is to discourage through motor traffic. And here it shows the Barcelona superblock model, which uses the same concept. It restricts the through traffic just outside of this superblock and create a low traffic speed, low traffic and low speed road network as just of local access only for the motor traffic. So you can see there are 10 kilometers per hour speed limit, and they are diverted with their routes. They can only do a U-turn, or there will be mostly one-way streets in this network to try to minimize through traffic going through the area to provide a safer and also is this place-making opportunity for people walking and cycling. This could be achieved by bus and cycle only roads with these time bus gates, and also modal filters that only allow non-motorized mode to go through within the main roads. So after all, there will be only more and more people uptaking cycling in the urban areas of Hong Kong with the completion of the cycle network in Kai Tak and West Kowloon, or even the Anderson Road ex-quarry site development in East Kowloon. It would be irresponsible as Transport Authority to just dump these vulnerable road users to the carriageway without providing any assistance in terms of infrastructure, as people cycling would, after all, wanting to start and end their journeys nearby. And to the right-hand corner, we can see the Central Kowloon route. It's due to complete by 2025, although we don't know whether it will be extended. It will take a lot of traffic away from the surface streets. Perhaps that will be the time that we can demand for, or we can prepare for that time to demand for high quality cycle infrastructure in Kowloon, or even across the urban area of Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. And I'm going to, there we are.
I'm going to stop sharing.
There we are. Okay, we're back. Okay, we just have a short presentation now on behalf of PedalMe in London. That's a delivery company using cargo bikes, and it's a great company. Their management are actually out on bikes delivering. They don't have time for these fancy Zoom seminars, so they asked me to present their latest story, which is quite, oh, hang on, I've lost it. Hang on. There we go. Yeah, which is a great story. In March in March this year, as UK entered lockdown, Lambeth Council decided to partner with PedalMe to assist with the delivery of thousands of care packages. This was essential home products and food to individuals and families most in need. This was the single largest cargo bike logistics operation in the UK. And you can see from this map here on the left, these are the actual deliveries over one day. PedalMe covered 20,000 kilometers over a month and a half to deliver nearly 10,000 packages, and that was 150,000 kilograms of food and supplies across Lambeth. So this was a great project. It showed that cargo bikes can really be an alternative to vans and to sort of heavy trucks. It kept the streets cleaner in terms of emissions. It kept the streets safer because large vehicles, as we know, are the most dangerous anywhere in the world. And it saved around 5 tons of CO2, just that one project alone. So it's really a great solution. It's something we need to be promoting in Hong Kong. So I just wanted to share that news from London. Now, what we're going to do now is have a discussion with Martin and I believe Justin and Oren, if Oren is around.
Yes, I am.
Yes, he is. There we are. Okay, let's add you to the spotlight and we'll add Justin. So all of it, yeah, let's see. Okay. So, I mean, there's some great points been made already, but Oren, I believe you have a sort of slightly different view of cycling as you've put forward in recent events. Perhaps you could just quickly give your position.
Okay, well, I mean, I'll try to do it quickly, but I'm speaking after at least 20 minutes of very persuasive arguments in favor of cycling, so I may need a little more than a few seconds. So anyway, let me start by saying something very simple. Often the advocates for cycling, I think correctly, pitch it against motor vehicles. I have nothing against saying that bikes should be given priority over motor vehicles. By the way, it's very echoey. I don't know, James, if it's again something that your end.
Sounds good here.
Yeah.
It sounds very good here for us.
It's okay. I just hear myself. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, so for me, the issue is very simply about in a dense urban environment where we have lots of people and very limited space. If we are redistributing the space away from motor vehicles, where does that space go? And the space issue with bikes is not just about lanes or carriageway space. It's also bike parking. Let's remember that. And I have pictures. I don't want to waste time now, but sharing my screen again. But bike parking is not a small thing. If you look at various European cities where biking is very popular, they have massive facilities for bike parking. So when we talk about the space requirements of bikes, it's not just lanes, it's also where you can leave your bike when you so efficiently run those errands and bike through the urban areas. And I've yet to hear a compelling solution to that problem, because the reality is, including in all those European cities where there is a cycling culture, is that people like, the whole point about biking is that is a convenience. And if the convenience means that you cannot park your bike at the place or very convenient, very close to the place you're going to, then in some ways it defeats the whole purpose. And so you see those vast fields of bikes parked where, you know what, I will share the screen because I do think it's important to see it. I just, let me just share it. Can you see the, can you see my screen? So you have these great facilities in Amsterdam and elsewhere, you know, where you know, they were designed for bike parking and it's amazing. But you also see a lot of this. And this is something you can afford in a city that has wide sidewalks, that have space for people, for cafes, and also for kind of messy bike parking, because the density is such and the road space and the pedestrian space is such that you can afford to do that. This is in Berlin. I mean, this is something you see in many places in Europe. And I just don't see how we fit that in the urban areas of Hong Kong. I just don't. So now we can talk about converting car parks into bike parking. I'm sure there are things that can be done. But I just want the conversation to be not just about carriageway space, but also about bike parking, because I think it's very, very important. Now, to Justin's point, I think he touched on a very important thing, which is uh, bike biking is not just about one street having a bike lane. It's about a network that needs to be dense enough and have enough reach into the urban areas. By the way, I'm only talking about dense urban areas. I'm leaving out all the places that already have significant use of biking and certainly potential for a lot more. So let's talk about the urban areas. So to find a solution, to find a lane, to find even bike parking here and there is never going to be enough, because unless you have a consistent, contiguous, continuous network that allows someone to get on a bike and expect to reach basically every corner of the urban area because you have a bike lane every 500 meters or whatever it is, without that, the whole usefulness of it is, I think, in question. So the research, the investigation that Martin is talking about, and with the kind of solutions that Justin is talking about, need to really address that, whether that is feasible. Because, and this is where I'm going to conclude, the point is, Justin, you said about New York, how biking is now a solution. And we have to be very precise about that. In New York City, especially in Manhattan, biking is a solution for a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people who use bikes. And they gained incredible infrastructure over the years of Michael Bloomberg and Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, who did an amazing job apportioning space for bikes out of carriageway correctly. But the majority of people in New York, in Manhattan, still are pedestrians who use mass transit to get to the place from which to start their pedestrian journey. So let's remember that. And when we talk about biking, it's a great solution, but it's a niche solution in dense urban areas. And I do think that the backbone in urban area, dense urban area mobility in Hong Kong is still public transport and pedestrian space. That should be the beginning of any solution. So the problem we see even in this picture here is a problem that needs to be solved, first of all, for pedestrians, to bring them from the bus stop, from the MTR station to where they're going. And then if we have a spare space, and that spare space has enough space for bike lanes and for bike parking in a way that doesn't compromise that backbone of mass transit and pedestrian space, I welcome biking wherever it's possible. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Oran. Very good. So perhaps, I don't know, shall I just give Martin a very brief, and then Justin a very brief response? Okay.
Yeah, Oran, thanks for that. Very, very nicely put, careful and thoughtful, and raising a lot of valid points. In a way, saying the same as myself, that we need to look at things. I just have a greater expectation of finding positive solutions, but to my earlier point, I don't see any reason for not looking and researching. I would just raise one kind of point of a quibble. Well, let's just say, I see a huge multiplicity of routes forward, the kinds of people who are riding early, the take-up, the process, the areas. I don't see any reason why we have to have a complete network when, if certain routes and certain smaller areas are made well suited to cycling, or people find them find it appropriate. Sha Tin schools network. I don't understand why there are school runs with motor cars in Sha Tin when every kid could jump on a bike and go to school. So just to home in on your points, Aaron, you raised two which I see as slightly in conflict. One is that it's a niche solution. It's like it's a niche solution for a very tiny number of people. And you also highlighted the major car parking facilities in Amsterdam, which are representing two very different scenarios. In Amsterdam, you've got kind of 60% cycling modal share, and if it's a niche solution, then you don't need that huge parking, or if you have a very small number of people, then you don't You can see what I mean.
Okay.
It's,
No,
it's
no.
not, doesn't
So
need.
let me just briefly clarify. I meant it's a niche solution. I think it can only be a niche solution in places like Manhattan or Hong Kong. Amsterdam is a different story. I'm not saying it's a niche solution there at all.
Right. So we don't need the mass. The parking problem is much more easily solvable and doesn't require huge infrastructure. As you mentioned, I mean, it's again, you raised a lot of good points. That, you know, the car parking either in building or on the street offers great opportunities because, as Justin very cautiously suggested, that a bike takes up 1/10 of the space of a parked car. I've seen 17 as another figure, and I do believe that there is a path forward to parking using repurposed car parking space. There's so much of it around, and we all know that the growth in car ownership is excessive, and perhaps this is one way to reverse it, to start making good use of that space.
Justin, do you have any comments here?
Yes. So first of all, I agree with what Oren said, that public transport is definitely the backbone of Hong Kong's transport network. No disagreement about that, and I really agree that we should prioritize public transport over everything else. Like, to be honest, especially vehicles. So in terms of vehicles, private vehicles that we should be taking space away from, cycling offers that autonomy of transport similar to private vehicles in a dense urban area context that is a short journeys within 5 kilometers. So I can see the potential of that being a first or last mile connections to and from MTR stations, especially that now as pedestrians or public transport users, normally if I live like quite far from an MTR station, I would use minibuses or buses to actually get around from my home to the nearest mass transit station. But would cycling be something that is feasible, that offers people with autonomy and weight-free alternative to public transport, that they could actually get to and from their destination quicker and easier, provided that there are safe infrastructure provided to complement public transport? That's one thing. And another thing is, again, a car parking space could actually fit 8 bicycles. If we agree that there should be we should abolish a vehicle first policy, could some parking be retrofitted to like bikes, especially that you can say that I agree in London and Manhattan, to a niche mode that not many people, in terms of wider context and percentage wise, that actually uptake cycling. So in a short-term period, would these retrofit of current car parking spaces be good enough to actually provide cycle parking spaces around and near where people would be? In the long term, if cycling really gained as a critical mass, actually uptake cycling, that would be something that we can consider later. But in a short-term period of time, would cycling parking would just be sufficient to be provided by retrofitting car parking spaces? Yeah, that's the point that I would.
Yeah, Ora, that's a good point. I mean, if you around Bonham Road, where you've done the isochrome studies, a lot of those buildings there have car parks. They're not really visible, but our building where I live has a space for around 150 cars out of 300 apartments, and no one's allowed to park a bike anywhere in that sort of multi-story car park. So, I mean, isn't there a potential solution there?
I'll tell you, yes, there is, and actually I mentioned it myself. I said I think it should be studied. I have nothing. That's where I agree completely with Martin. I think that it is something that needs to be looked at seriously and with an eye to, improve things and provide a better cycling infrastructure. I'll tell you just a tiny anecdote, which is where I started thinking of this problem. Some years ago, I had a meeting in an office building in Manhattan, and someone, it was the morning, like 9 a.m., someone walked into the lift with his bike because there was no place to bike it out, to park it outside, or because he felt it wasn't safe to park it outside. And I have to say that it was combined with a bit of an attitude about like, I'm here with my bike, make room. And all of us have to squeeze so that he could take his bike to his office. And I was thinking, okay, how is that scalable? What if everybody thinks it's their right to bike to work because biking is so virtuous, and as we're being told? And so I think Bonham Road is one thing, but I'm thinking of Shangwan where I work. Most buildings don't have car parks. I mean, there's actually very few car parks in Shangwan. You can repurpose all of them, which would be difficult, completely to bike parking, and still you wouldn't have enough capacity to make that a significant mode of transport serving people who want to work in Shangwan. That's my point. I'm not saying that there is no room for more biking in the urban areas, but I just think the scalability of it is what troubles me. And of course, where it begins to brush against the space available for pedestrians, which is constrained to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, which is a huge problem in Shangwan as well. So, Martin, did you want to?
Yeah, just a couple of throwouts to respond. I always tell people who, like your friend in the lift there, who perhaps has a flashy bike, he doesn't want to leave it outside because he's an important person who wears lycra perhaps and is cycling around. Use a bike that you're not afraid to lose, and it becomes 10 times more valuable. If you've got it doesn't have to be an old banger. A cheapish bike can go very smoothly, and yet you know that if once a year or once in 2 years it goes, you get another one, and you're already well ahead of the game. The other option in terms of parking in Shangwan area, the public bikes, the share bikes that came to Hong Kong. They die down a little. Hopefully, they will still thrive. If each bike is being used 4 or 6 times a day, then the cost to society of parking it becomes that much less.
I agree in principle. It's about how it all adds up and how the numbers work. By the way, I want to respond to Alok's quick comment about taking your bike on the bus. Well, I mean, to the extent that you meant to say that buses in Hong Kong are, riding well below capacity, point taken. But I think that in general, the idea of taking bikes on mass transit, especially during peak hour, I mean, needless to say, that's a very problematic idea. The space conflicts are obvious. And I'm reminded of I think it was maybe someone, maybe it was Andy Byford who was leading the MTA in New York, who said that something about what's the MTA's policy on taking your bike on the subway? And he said it's a law of deterrence. Again, I'm paraphrasing. Meaning, if you think you can take your bike on the subway without getting really nasty looks and comments, go ahead. And he said that works pretty well. No one would dare do it during rush hour. But if people want to do it during the slow hours, go ahead, and no one will say anything. I think it's a pretty good approach to that problem.
On the buses, I mean, we see in the US that a lot of buses have these forks on the front, and you can take 3 or 4 bikes. I mean, this would be a help for cyclists who.
I have to say, if I was on that bus trying to get somewhere, and you had to wait for 2 minutes that someone tied their bike to the front, I'm not sure I'd be a very happy mass transit rider.
They're very quick. 20 seconds.
They can be very quick. Yeah, I've seen them done very quick, but
average.
Yeah. Because in Hong Kong, it's very hard to get your bike from one. I think it's what you talked about, Justin, as well, is about the network. It's very hard to get from Hong Kong Island to the other side, to Kowloon on a bike. You probably have to take a ferry or go on the MTR and face the angry stairs, as Oren's talking about, or take your wheel off, or take a van. So really, to get a bike off the island is quite problematic. And if you could just stick it on the front of a cross harbour bus, then that might be a small solution. But yeah, Justin, do you have any comments on what we just discussed?
About parking, I just want to add one more thing that we know that we talked about parking minimum, and London has, for the last 10 years, already seized the parking minimum and they provide a parking minimum just for cycling, just for cycles, but not private vehicles. And that would be one of the way in forward, not saying right now, but in the future, if we really want to prioritize sustainable modes and try to minimize people's willingness to drive to work, that would be one of the things that we could consider, especially to provide cycle parking rather than actual car parking in no matter residential or commercial development. That could be something that we could also look into in the future.
Okay, okay. Oren, would you like to say anything?
No, I think it's a very interesting discussion.
It is. It's very good. It's very good. I feel like we might be getting somewhere, but we're really running short on time, unfortunately.
I don't need to have the last word.
Yeah. So I think we should wrap up because we're already 15 minutes over allotted time. So I'm going to have to say goodbye. Martin, would you like to? Martin's looking very disappointed that we're ending the discussion. So.
Not at all. I think I agree with Oren. It was a helpful, productive discussion.
Okay.
Well done, us.
Okay, good.
Well, you know what? I will say one thing. I think that where we are all on the same page is that the allocation of space in Hong Kong of road space, of street space, is way too skewed towards motor vehicles. I think on that we can all agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah. I think that is an excellent point to end this conference on, which is rethinking vehicles first. So thank you, Oren. I couldn't have said it better. Okay, so thank you, everybody. And it's been a fantastic time. We were pressed for time the whole time. So I think if we do this again next time, we will probably have a less ambitious schedule and longer discussion, because that's where really the jewels are hiding. So thank you very much to all of our attendees and to our panelists for all of the sessions. And this will be available on YouTube Live, and we'll probably put an edited version up on Transit Jam as well, so people can take a look afterwards. There's been a ton of questions over the bike issue, which we don't have time to get into now, so we will try to keep the conversation going offline or online later on to do that. So that's it. Thanks from all of us here, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.